Story 1. Somehow ended up having to do the penis and scrotum dissection in medical school anatomy class. It is burned into my brain. The eyeball and brain part was pretty disturbing too. Okay, I think I just hated all of it. Story 2. When I was a new nurse, I cared for a man with wet gangrene on his right leg. The entire leg, from knee to toe, was degloved when his family helped him reposition in bed. Holding a rotting knee socket made of flesh was very unpleasant. Story 3. My own skull. I fell down a flight of stairs and banged my head on a textured wall, which basically scalped me. Sitting on the bottom step and slightly dazed, I touched the top of my head to check the damage and felt something hard, smooth, and slimy. Is anyone else in the Own Skull Touchers Club? Story 4. I had a friend's brains all over my shirt, face, in my hair, and in my ear. It was almost as bad as sand. Just when I thought I got it all, there was another piece. I was in a bad car accident with him and 2 other people. I worked at a prison and had a feces and urine mixture thrown on me. I also had to search through feces to look for contraband, suspected balloon swallowing. I responded to a car accident where the driver lost his arm. I found it in the field, grabbed it as if shaking his hand, and ran across the field to the helicopter so they could preserve it. I am tired of gross situations. Story 5. Not me, but this made me remember my grandmother when I was a small child, around 3 or 4 years old. She was babysitting me while I was sick with the stomach flu. I started to gag and vomit, so she ran up and literally caught my vomit in her bare hands. I don't remember much, but I am sure there was no bucket or trash can nearby, which is why she did it. If I were her, I would have preferred to just clean it up since the floor was hardwood. Story 6. My dog ran into a fence that had loose chicken wire. It cut his stomach open, and his intestines were protruding through a gushing wound. The cut was about 5 inches long, with approximately 2 inches deep, enough to cause a hernia or disembowelment. I had to apply pressure to the wound and keep his intestines inside while my wife rushed us to the animal veterinarian. At first, I used my hand to cover the wound, but my wife tore my shirt off so I could use it instead to apply pressure. Fortunately, he survived. He seemed unfazed, possibly in shock. I passed out from exhaustion at the veterinarian's office due to the adrenaline rush. A similar event happened with my first dog as a child. She chased a rabbit and impaled herself on a low-hanging tree branch. Her chest was ripped open about the size of a tennis ball. I also had to hold her together while we went to the veterinarian. Story 7. Shrimp heads rotten to the point of starting to liquefy, with some also rotting wheat bran mixed in, after being digested and excreted by hundreds of fly larvae for a week in temperatures above 30 degrees Celsius and 60 to 70% humidity. I was the intern who had to separate the larvae from the substrate by hand. At some point, my glove broke without me realizing it, and I touched the warm, maggoty shrimp juices directly. I used to love shrimp broth. Now I can barely stomach it unless I season it enough to mask the shrimp smell. Story 8. I worked at a pet store in high school. A woman brought in a large tarantula that was not eating. The manager, a self-proclaimed spider expert, decided to investigate. He gently flipped the tarantula onto its back to check its underside. We all leaned in close. That is when we saw them. The spider's abdomen, between the armored plates, was writhing. It was packed solid with hundreds of tiny, white, parasitic worms, squirming just beneath the surface like a bag of living rice. As we watched, horrified, a few of them started pushing their way out through the thin membrane of its joints. My manager had to euthanize it, and he had to touch that pulsating, worm-filled abdomen to do it. He said it felt like a crunchy water balloon filled with squirming needles. I quit a week later. Story 9. I was the primary caregiver for my mother, who had dementia, for 10 years. In the last 4 years, her incontinence began and progressively worsened. Often, serious incidents occurred after the daytime caregiver, who was there to assist me and provide a break, left. Because of this, I had no choice but to perform tasks similar to those of a certified nursing assistant. You can imagine what I had to see and handle. Story 10. I once dropped my car keys into the small silver trash can in the women's restroom stall. I had to fish through used sanitary products to retrieve them. Story 11, my former spouse. Does my former spouse count? He was the worst person in the world. That has to count. Story 12. Plenty, but recently my puppy had roundworm in its vomit, still wriggling. The veterinarian asked if I could bring it in. Wearing a glove and using a bag, I scooped the vomit and worm. The worm was 5 feet long, squirming out. Ivermectin is very potent. Every dog in the house passed dead roundworms within a day. Story 13. Probably the dead mouse water incident. I was at my parents' house helping them clean the back porch and their lawn furniture for the summer. A mouse had recently died in their cistern. The water was not potable to begin with, and we did not want to waste it, so using it to spray down outdoor surfaces seemed like a good idea. Right up until I was trying to adjust one of the connectors on the hose and water sprayed everywhere, including my face and mouth. Now I have the unpleasant knowledge of what dead mouse tastes like. Tastes exactly the way it smells. Story 14. Had to help move an unfortunate sheep that had died after getting stuck under a fallen tree during a storm. It was soggy and had been in the summer heat for roughly 2 weeks during monsoon season. It was ripe. We didn't have gloves, just a tarp. After we moved it, I ran straight to the pond nearby and rinsed my entire body, clothes, and boots before going back to the house for a proper shower. Still wretched thinking about it 25 years later. Story 15. A Hickman line coming out of my chest. I had a bone marrow transplant, and they put in a Hickman line so they could give me the cells, take blood, give chemotherapy, and also total body nutrients if I needed them. The Hickman line allows all of these to happen. It is a long tube, so if infection travels up it, it has a long way to go before it reaches the vein above your heart that it accesses. I had to clean the site and apply a new bandage every week. I could do it with a mirror, no problem, but it was very strange touching a tube that is outside your body but connected to your vascular system. Anytime I accidentally moved it too fast or touched too close to the entry point, my whole body would cringe. It was the same with the peripherally inserted central catheter lines in my arm before this. I had to distract myself to stop freaking out when the nurse changed the bandage. I had images of it being pulled out of my arm even though I knew it was held in with stitches and hooks. Story 16. I jumped barefoot onto what I thought was a stump in a grassy field. In fact, it was a large creamy pile of cow diarrhea. The top was sunbaked, and the middle was warm and very creamy. Story 17. Mom made a steak and cut all the fat and gristle off. One of our cats stole it from the garbage and ate it whole. I know this because when I sat on my bed to put my socks on for school, I put my hand in something warm and slimy. An 8-inch strip of semi-chewed steak gristle and feline stomach mucus. Also, the first time I was intimate with a man. You haven't lived until you've been mid-forearm deep with a special friend. Story 18. I don't know. The drain was clogged and no tool would dislodge the filthy, mushy mass inside, so I used my hands. Someone ran a grease-dispensing sink and a washing machine for all the clothes into the same floor drain. A small restaurant washed the bathroom cleaning clothes in the same washing machine that cleaned the kitchen and dining area clothes. Based on the amount of long hair embedded in the grease, I believe the owner was bringing in personal laundry. Story 19. Does wearing gloves count? I was a nurse in a step-down unit helping a patient eat because they were a total feed with dementia and could not feed themselves. He was there for pneumonia. As I was feeding him, he started coughing, and fortunately, I was wearing gloves. I held my hand under his mouth and said, "Spit it out. Spit it out," thinking he was choking on food. This patient spat out the biggest, greenest, warmest, slimiest glob of mucus I have ever seen. It was bigger than a silver dollar in the palm of my hand. I absolutely hate mucus and was not expecting that. My instinct was to flip my hand over to get it off, but I dropped it all over the front of his gown. His immediate reaction was to smear it everywhere. Total bed change after that. Gown, bath, sheets, everything. Story 20. I used to be a medical evacuation pilot. Very rarely, the flight nurses would ask for our assistance mid-flight. We were a 2-crew aircraft, so one pilot leaving the cockpit during cruise was not a big deal. One such request came from an obviously dire situation. I was asked to help, so I quickly went back to do whatever was within my ability. Before I knew what was happening, One of the nurses disinfected my hand and guided it to plug a hole in this patient's chest. I just stood there, my hand inside a patient's chest, scared to move for what seemed like an hour but was likely less than a minute. Story 21. Used to work for a railway. On numerous occasions, had to do body removal to ensure on-time performance. Story 22. My kid's snot. This was the first time I had touched someone else's snot. I love my girl, but at that moment, I hated everything about life. Story 23. I attended an educational taxidermy class on a date. I was not prepared to disembowel a laboratory rat. I guess I did not know what to expect. The date went surprisingly well, but we are no longer together. Story 24. When I worked as a nanny, one of the families I worked for had a dog. This dog got into the bins behind a nearby takeaway that had caused severe food poisoning to multiple people I knew, including me. This was the kind of food poisoning that requires hospitalization. Whatever rotten meat and spices the dog ate from the bins, then vomited and defecated all over the floor, was the most vile thing I have ever had to touch, smell, or be in a room with. The dog survived this, but honestly, I do not know how. Story 25. Raccoon feces can be toxic to humans. I raised a batch of orphaned raccoons, and I guarantee that once you smell it, you will never forget it. Story 26. Probably cleaning out a clogged drain. I had to reach in and pull out this strange mix of hair and gunk. It was like a science experiment gone wrong. Definitely a moment I will never forget. Story 27. I have removed calf remains from inside a cow before, rotten handful by rotten handful. That was not particularly gross, just smelly and required a lot of cleanup afterward. Gross is just a trick of the mind. Logically consider if this thing can hurt you in any way, take necessary precautions if you can, and get on with the task. Story 28. Anyone who has ever given birth knows that afterward, you pass blood clots. Sometimes really large ones, like the size of a lemon or bigger. Sometimes they get stuck and need to be removed by hand. I do not think I need to go into more detail, but it was horrifying. Story 29. As a former certified nursing assistant of a few years, I have had several experiences. It was either cleaning up a deceased individual who evacuated their bowels upon death, or the time I had to empty a colostomy bag of someone who had Clostridium difficile infection. I still vividly remember the last one's stench. I almost vomited, and I have a pretty strong stomach. Story 30. In home care, I once had a patient with a stage 4 pressure sore on his coccyx. Occasionally, while cleaning that wound, my glove would get stuck on his exposed bone. Story 31. I once fostered 3 8-week-old puppies. Their pregnant mother was rescued from a shelter. I would come home from work, put my hand on the apartment door, and inhale, knowing that a tsunami of puppy paw prints was waiting on the other side. Story 32. About a year ago, I took in a stray cat that I found in my backyard. She was very malnourished. I took her to the veterinarian and found out she was feline leukemia virus positive and already in poor condition. The veterinarian said I could either euthanize her immediately or hope for a miracle that she might pull through. I took her home and gave her a lot of love, treats, and attention. I called it the cat hospice. A few weeks later, she became lethargic, but I thought she was okay since she was eating, drinking, and using the litter box normally. One day, I woke up to the overwhelming scent of blood and decay. It turned out she was pregnant, which neither the veterinarian nor I had realized because she was so malnourished. I had to pick up and dispose of 6 underdeveloped, decomposing kitten fetuses. My hand went right through the first one, so I used a lighter touch after that. I took her in for euthanasia the next day. I still feel guilty that I did not do it sooner, so she would not have had to endure all that. Story 33. While working as a veterinary nurse, we had a dog come in after eating a ton of chocolate. He was given apomorphine to induce vomiting, and I had to clean up the chocolate vomit. Stringy saliva and stomach contents that smell like chocolate are absolutely disgusting. Story 34. If you have ever done any hunting that requires field dressing, then you know there is nothing like reaching into the chest cavity of a deer to disconnect tissue. Story 35. I was a direct support professional and worked with people with disabilities. One day, After we had helped everyone get ready for bed, one of our residents got up and walked over to the table. She ripped off her colostomy bag and slapped it on the table in front of us. It slid off and landed on my knee, so without hesitation, I grabbed it and threw it on the floor. Everyone was covered. It was a nightmare. Story 36. One day in biology class at school, for an exercise, we were asked to touch a turkey's heart. Couldn't. Story 37. One of my chickens had fly strike not too long ago. Flies lay eggs on exposed skin, often near the cloaca, and the maggots start eating the chicken alive. I had to pick all the maggots off her by hand and treat her wounds. It was awful. Story 38. Brain matter on a hot tarmac after a person ran the helicopter line. The helicopter was not cleared and was having problems with the rotors and the tilt. I am not an expert on helicopters. I was an on-deck firefighter. The person quickly moved down the line to chock the wheels without the proper release, and then a severe accident occurred. Story 39. Medical device representative here. I was present during a double mastectomy of a patient with breast cancer. I was curious about the procedure, and the surgeon reached into a container and handed me a recently removed cancerous breast to hold as he explained how the cancer grows and appears in a patient. It was sad and somewhat surreal. Story 40. My mom was in the hospital getting cardioverted for arrhythmia. When they finished, she said she had to use the restroom and needed help because of the intravenous line. I offered to help her as there were no nurses available. When she finished, I wiped her. While I was wiping, she really finished. 6 years later, my parents were living with us because my dad could barely walk on his own. His visiting nurse had to cancel due to bad weather, so my husband and I had to bathe him. He had a golf ball-sized hole in his bottom cheek that was oozing. I found out about it by cleaning the area. During the 3 weeks he had been staying with us after leaving rehabilitation, he never told me about it. It must have been excruciatingly painful. Rest in peace, Dad. Story 41. Probably any random bit of human flesh. I worked at a human tissue donation place in the decontamination department. Story 42. Housekeeping in a retirement home. A woman was preparing for a colonoscopy and did not make it to the bathroom in time. There was a long trail from her recliner all the way down the hall to the bathroom. I had to clean the mess on the floor, walls, and toilet. It was absolutely nauseating. Story 43. I had a cockroach in my sock this morning. I am not sure if it was alive when I put my foot in, but it was definitely dead when I took it out to see what that strange lump was. Story 44. Years ago, I was running a small family-owned restaurant, and money was always tight. By tight, I mean we needed the money from the weekend to make payroll every week. If we had to close on a Saturday, people would not get paid. We had not had the grease trap pumped in quite some time because we did not have the money. One Saturday, it finally filled up, and pretty much nothing was draining. It was a large trap in the floor, located near the walk-in cooler. I had to manually clean it out without any personal protective equipment so that my staff could all get paid on Tuesday. Gross does not even come close. Story 45. The afternoon my eldest son vomited in my car on the way home from school. I was forced to sit in various half-chewed, half-digested school lunch items, soaking everything through to my jeans, while I had to force myself to keep swallowing my own bile and adhere to traffic laws for the 20-minute drive. It scarred me for life. Story 46. I worked at a climate-controlled storage facility. The property consisted of 3 buildings, 2 of which were 3 stories each. One day, we kept receiving complaints about a horrible smell in one of the buildings. It turned out that someone had a severe bowel incident in the stairwell on the 3rd floor, causing a streak of waste down the entire 2nd and 1st story walls. Someone had to clean it. Guess who was assigned the task? I resigned the next day. Story 47. My wife got food poisoning last night, which resulted in her vomiting all over the bathroom floor about 6 hours later. Story 48. I have a container of fish food for a koi pond. Overnight, several slugs got in and ate the food. The next morning, I put my hand in and got a handful of slug slime. Story 49. Not the worst here, but one time my dog was having trouble passing stool because he ate a baseball, and I had to pull out the strings from his rear. Story 50. A decomposing frog's intestines. I was 9 years old, and my brother and a friend from down the street had found it. They were playing with it, throwing it at me, and I had to catch it to avoid it staining my shirt. Story 51. Abscess and infected tissue from a cow's liver. Visually, it is not that bad, but the smell of infected tissue makes me want to gag. Story 52. I had to go into a bundle of wires that had a rat's nest in it. I shook out the nest. When I began separating the wires, I put my finger in a warm, gooey substance. When I pulled it out, I realized I had smashed a baby rat that didn't fall out. I actually mashed it in half. It made me gag. Story 53. A 25-pound abdominal tumor in a plastic bucket or a severed human leg. The tumor looked disturbingly like a beef roast. Story 54. I was a stripper for a very short time a long time ago. I was bullied a lot, and my good friend, who made me do it, told me to strike back by stealing all of their costumes, which were actually underwear. It seemed like a cool idea, except that some of them were hard with something. I feel like I am going to puke just writing this. Story 55. I shoved my arm all the way to the elbow down the floor drain in a kitchen when I used to think working harder would be rewarded. Story 56. My ex's intestines after he was sliced with a Bowie knife and disemboweled. I recently got a job at PetSmart as a pet specialist. I have, with gloves, touched guinea pigs with ringworm and administered antifungal prescription medication. Barehandedly scooped up dead fish, sump water, dead pinky mice and their brains, snakes, tarantulas, lizards, geckos, a chameleon, pet mice, hamsters, birds, frogs, shrimp, hermit crabs, snails, worms, crickets, bearded dragons. Their droppings have a strong smell second only to dead fish, cats, cat vomit, and all the animals' droppings listed above. I have cleaned up tons of dog urine already, scrubbed fish tanks, and been bitten by a guinea pig, which usually do not bite. Hamsters are the ones you have to watch out for trying to bite. Right now, our ball python will not eat, so we keep trying to coax him with a debrained pinky mouse to no avail. His weight is still on target since he came to us overweight, a little chonk. It is gross but incredibly rewarding. I adore the little animals we have in store. I am still very new, so the only dead animals I have handled have been fish. My coworkers say it is rare to have a small mammal or reptile die in our care. They are all very knowledgeable and extremely vigilant, but I understand it will happen sooner or later. Story 57. Part of my thumb. A few years ago, I was grinding meat in a large grinder and went too fast, so my hand got caught in it. I pulled it out and turned off the machine before my entire hand was injured. I opened it up, and part of my thumb was just sitting in the grinder. Story 58. A rotten potato that squished into itself when I touched it made me so nauseous that I could not eat for hours. Story 59. Not had to, as I did both voluntarily and was wearing gloves, but I think they were neat experiences and I would like to share. One time, I had my hand inside a cow's stomach. The cow was cannulated, which means it has a porthole in the side of its rumen so scientists can take stomach samples for nutrition analysis. Felt like very hot oatmeal and did not stink too badly. The other time, I dissected a very dead roadkill deer head to get its lymph glands for chronic wasting disease analysis. This was part of a workshop weekend I attended in college and was my favorite activity there. The woman running the workshop even offered me a job doing this. I asked her to give me the grossest specimen she had. The deer's skin was blue and its gums were green. Smelled very bad, but it was fascinating. I have smelled rotten brains before. They were blue, astonishingly blue, but I did not have to touch them. Story 60. When I was 12, I used to visit my cousins on their farm. We would play with the barn cats because we were kids. Once, a barn cat was giving birth and we just had to watch. One kitten was born inside the sack, and the mother ignored it. The next kitten came out and the mother cleaned it. I didn't know what to do, so I tore open the sack and pulled out the kitten. I cleaned it with my shirt and put it to nurse. It began nursing, and the mother finally noticed it. I wiped my hands on the hay bales and proceeded to eat my picnic lunch. Apparently, I was gross. Story 61. My wife threw up and couldn't make it to the toilet, so she threw up in our sink. Naturally, that clogged the sink. She couldn't stomach cleaning it. So, I reached in up to my wrist and massaged the clumps of vomit until it went down the drain. Story 62. Came home from a one-week vacation to find the small chest freezer in the garage had stopped working. It was half full of assorted meat, which had started to rot, and red-gray liquid had leaked from the drain plug across the garage floor. This happened in July in a poorly ventilated garage where it got really hot. Story 63. My dog has produced some very unusual feces, and I only had paper towels. Some of it touched me. Story 64. A warm toilet seat, especially if my brother or my dad were recently in there. My story is not as crazy, but it unsettles me because I lost my senses of smell and temperature, so I never know if it is safe or not. Story 65. I detailed a car that someone had vomited in once. I told my boss if anyone comes with something like that again to tell them to leave. Story 66. A burnt snake wrapped around a car door handle. If you have encountered a burnt snake, you will know it has the only smell worse than death itself. Story 67. I did have to touch it with my hands but moved a block of human waste about the size of a sedan. When I was working for a wastewater treatment site, all the waste and inorganic material were removed, and the clean water was pumped back into the river. The organic material was sent to farmers for fertilizer. Story 68. Seaweed. Probably not the worst thing in this thread, but I have an irrational, almost phobia-level fear of seaweed, and I completely freak out if it touches me. It is very unpleasant, and I actually got uncomfortable goosebumps writing this. Yuck. Story 69. The first thing that comes to mind is when I worked in the Central Sterile Services Department of a private hospital surgery wing. A woman wanted to keep the implants from her previous breast enlargement surgery after deciding to have a reduction. I, along with an operating department practitioner, had to trim the fused flesh off the implants before we could return them. Story 70. I stood in warm dog vomit. It was really stringy and thick when I lifted my foot. I have been a nurse for 25 years and have seen and touched everything, but because that was unexpected, it traumatized me. Story 71. I was in an Uber at night one time. After rummaging around in my purse for a minute, I remembered that I had a very overripe kiwi in there and figured it got squished. That was what the slimy green substance on the back of my hand was. So I wiped it off my hand and immediately realized that it was actually a large, viscous mucus that did not belong to me. I think I might have swallowed it because I had to get it out of my mouth, which was faster than rolling down the window to spit it out. I'm not sure though. I tried to block it out because it was traumatic. Story 72. My dog found an intact, partially decomposed dead squirrel in the fenced backyard and decided it would be a great one-gulp, no-chew meal. His stomach did not agree, so I had to dispose of this unsavory meal when it ended up on the dining room floor. I had to disconnect so hard to clean it up that it took me hours to fully come back into my body. Story 73. Worked on a pig farm for a few years and had a sow that got a pig stuck in labor. Tried to help her pass it with medication but unfortunately had to sleeve her and see if I could manually get it out. While pulling on the half-decomposed piglet, it ripped in half. That was one of the few things that turned my stomach while working there. Story 74. A grown man's genitals were involved when I worked as an in-home care provider. He requested that I apply lotion to his private areas. He said it was okay and not inappropriate. He became upset when I refused to apply lotion to his testicles and reminded me to include those as well. He was fully capable of using his hands. Story 75. A man who was my friend and neighbor died in my apartment building, and the leasing office did not remove his body for a few weeks, so the smell and flies were horrendous. They eventually responded to our calls and removed his body, but the problem was he died in his bathtub, and they only removed the body. In the tub, they left behind water filled with decomposing and liquefying organs, so there was little improvement in the smell and flies after the body was removed. I was documenting all of this for city and state officials and lawyers. One of the most disgusting aspects was the flies. I had never seen flies look or behave like this. They were so fat and swollen from feasting on him that they could barely fly. They lazily circled in the air and were so slow that you could easily kill them, and when smashed, Blood from my friend and neighbor would spray everywhere, sometimes into your face. It was traumatizing to have to wipe his blood and remains off my food, belongings, and person. It got worse. I went into his bathroom to take pictures of the tub. When he died, the water had been running, and the weight of everything caused the tub to collapse through the floor into the bathroom of the apartment below, which was thankfully empty at the time. Both apartments were unlocked. I entered the one downstairs for additional documentation. On entering, there was an unavoidable puddle of blood, moldy water, remains, flies, and maggots I had to pass through to reach him. They did not clean the tub for over 6 months, and it had been about 4 months when I entered. While the decomposing remains were obviously nightmare-inducing, I cannot stress enough that the smell was the worst part. Smelling my dead friend rotting made it unbearable. I had to cover my nose and mouth about 10 feet before entering the building because the odor was that strong, and to protect myself from thousands, if not millions, of flies swarming and flying into my mouth. Then I had to run to my top-floor apartment as fast as possible, but still dry heaved from the stench. It was hellish. I will never forget it. Story 76. Cleaning up a wastewater pit that was blocked by grease from restaurants. Wore a full hazardous material suit to go down the pit and shovel grease and waste. Story 77. I was raised on a ranch. When I was 12, my grandfather's favorite heifer got loose, and we went out looking for her. We had to find her and confirm if she was dead or stolen. Near the river, I walked into a wall of sweet decay. I knew then something had died, but I had to confirm it was Goldie. It smelled so bad my eyes watered, and I got closer to the trees in case I had to lean over since I was starting to dry heave. I stepped over a root, but my pant leg got caught on a branch, and I fell onto something squishy and soft. It stank in a way I can't describe. I tried pushing myself up, but my hand pushed into it, and I fell face first into the dead cow. The smell got in my nose, into my mouth, and onto my shirt. It was gelled rotten meat and hide. The branch that snagged my pant leg was her horn. Goldie had been struck by lightning during the thunderstorm we had a few nights earlier. This was New Mexico heat in July, so she had baked quite a bit. My grandfather heard me screaming and vomiting between breaths. I remember maggots crawling on my face. I can still recall that taste, and it makes me dry heave each time. It has been over 20 years, and that memory is still fresh. Story 78. I pooped in the toilet once. Then my glasses fell in. I had to fish them out and wash them off. Gross. Story 79. We had a clogged drain at the bottom of our grain elevator. We call the area the pit. There was probably a foot of water sitting in it. Fermented grain is not the most pleasant smell, and stagnant water makes it worse. I had to get on my knees to clear out the drain. I pulled out handfuls of wet, rotten grain. The water still had not started to drain, so there was more to remove. I was doing everything I could to keep my head out of the water when I wrapped my hand around what felt like a strange rope. It turned out to be a bloated rat that was almost 2 feet long. I grabbed it by the tail and pulled it out. It was just plain nasty. I took 3 showers right after that. I was done. Story 80. Retired nurse here. You name it, I have treated it. Gangrenous and infected wounds and extremities, abscessed testicles, all bodily fluids, a prolapsed rectum, colostomy bags, feces, vomit, urine, mucus. You get the idea. Story 81. Went to my parents' house after they had been away for a month to restock the refrigerator. I had been back a few times before to water plants, but saw no point in getting food until they returned. When I opened the refrigerator, I found that they had apparently turned it off the day they left. Both the refrigerator and freezer were off. The freezer was full of food, both cooked and uncooked. What was in the refrigerator made me vomit. I was glad because it meant there was nothing left when I opened the freezer. I spent what felt like hours dry heaving as I took the drawers into the garden, emptied them into bin bags, and hosed them out. I double-bagged the bags and mopped out the refrigerator and freezer. I found baking soda and left it in the empty refrigerator and freezer. I washed all the shelves and drawers again. It was a double-wide unit, so it was even worse. Thank God bin day was the next day. I put everything in the bins and made my way home, Apparently, it still smelled a bit 2 days later when they got home, but at least everything was clean and gone. Story 82. Our senior dog died outside. She wanted to go out, and when she didn't come back, we went to look for her and found her cold in a patch of sunlight. We dug her grave near the barn she liked to hide in. When it was time to carry her there, someone took her front half, and I took her back. As I wrapped my arms around her hindquarters to lift her, I accidentally put both of my hands into her post-mortem stool. She was a Great Dane, so she and her stool were very large. Story 83. I used to be an eye bank technician recovering corneas from deceased people for transplant purposes. We would go to hospitals, funeral homes, and the medical examiner's office to recover from bodies. Medical examiners' bodies were always the worst. Sometimes they do something called a face peel, where they literally peel the face back and sew it back on. This person's face was distorted. You could not even tell where the eyes and nose used to be. There was a tooth coming out of his nostril. Story 84. Probably a suction machine that was not emptied for 6 months. Saliva and food turn into hazardous waste when they marinate. Story 85. I'm a little hungover and these comments are making me feel like I'm going to be ill. Why did I think reading these comments was a good idea? Story 86. A deceased woman had been left unattended for more than 24 hours on the hottest day of the year with the window shut. Honestly, the smell was worse than the touch, which is saying something. However, what was worse was managing the devastated family. The police are not sufficiently trained to handle such situations. Story 87. My own ring finger bone was partially degloved after going through a window pane of a door someone was slamming on me. I instinctively put out my hand to stop it. I immediately grabbed that hand with the other, and the tips of a couple of my fingers slid across what felt like slightly bumpy but kind of polished wet rock. On an unrelated note, I wrapped a towel around it, and the surgeon later told me that some of that towel will likely remain in my finger forever. I no longer have feeling along one side of that finger. It is more like it is perpetually asleep. Story 88. A friend's acquaintance is an elderly man with Alzheimer's disease, and his house was in disarray. It was time to place him into hospice care. We cleaned his house, and his bathroom sink was covered in dried waste, with floors grimy from decades of neglect. It was worse than or equivalent to living in an abandoned house. Story 89. Muddy material inside a city main sewer line, black sludge in a sewer line underneath a house, and soap scum with white sludge buildup. The third one is ironically the worst. The texture is indescribably bad and smells unpleasant, but the texture is just nasty. Story 90. I had to help perform a necropsy on a dead sea turtle that had been floating for an unknown amount of time. It was missing its head and 3 flippers. The shell was so rotten that when I tried to pull it from the water, my hands just went through it. I had to jump off a dock and wrestle it up to the shore. I smelled so bad that I had to ride back to the laboratory in the bed of our pickup truck. I threw away the clothes I had been wearing, but I could still smell it on myself for days despite washing with every cleanser I could think of, including tomato juice and chlorhexidine. Story 91. My dogs killed a squirrel, and one of them brought its head into my room. The next day, I had to clean regurgitated squirrel entrails off my floor. Story 92. Lots of emergency room stories. One that stands out involves an elderly lady who came in with a compound tremalleolar fracture of the right ankle, all 3 bones broken and protruding through the skin. She had apparently stood on her bed, then stepped off it, landing on that foot. This was around 2 a.m., with only nurses working and an on-call medical doctor at a very small hospital. We received orders to administer morphine and promethazine and to splint the ankle for transport to a larger facility with orthopedic services available. My partner administered the medications, while I prepared the splint. Suddenly, the patient developed a wild-eyed look and started kicking her legs very forcefully and rapidly. I tried to hold her leg down, but she was winning the struggle. The foot that was not being held with intact bones was literally flopping around. We determined this had to be a reaction and obtained orders to give diphenhydramine, which calmed her quickly. I managed to get the splint on and secured. I will never forget that foot flipping around. Story 93. I did not have to, but my school organized an event where we visited booths in the gymnasium, and they provided information about various topics. I touched a sheep's eye. Story 94. Decaying starfish and crayfish innards. In 8th grade, we had an entire semester of progressively more complex dissection labs, starting with clams and ending with frogs. Each time we had a test on the most recent lab, we were also tested on the previous ones again. The specimens from the previous labs were saved and reused for the tests, which was fine for most of them since they were preserved with formaldehyde. Unfortunately, formaldehyde does not work very well on starfish or crayfish. Digging around in a decaying, reeking sea creature, trying my hardest to identify what was left of its anatomy amid the sludgy mess of its innards was a special kind of hell. Thankfully, I had science at the very end of the day, so at least I did not have to deal with smelling like putrefying marine life mixed with formaldehyde for hours until school let out. Story 95. Probably the dead cat I picked up off the side of the road. One of its eyes had fallen out and was hanging by a thread of tissue. I picked it up with a blanket and carried it to the woods where I buried it. I have 2 cats of my own and couldn't imagine letting it stay there to be ogled by people walking past or run over again by people who think it is fun. I had never held something dead before. It was so stiff. The smell was oddly not bad. More organic, earthy, simultaneously sour and sweet. It was both familiar and completely unique. Story 96. When I was in 2nd or 3rd grade, my class took a field trip to a farm. A cow had just given birth there, and I kid you not, they kept the afterbirth for the kids to touch. Story 97. An infected wound full of maggots on a sheep. I had to treat it to save the poor animal. It was not pleasant. Story 98. One of my students with autism took the drain out of the urinal and was about to put it in his mouth, so I had to take it away. On another occasion, the same child reached his hand into the toilet after using it and touched my face with his wet hands. I used to teach special education in preschool and assisted in potty training. Update. After reading through the comments, my situation does not sound so bad. Story 99. I was a crew chief in the Air Force and one of our jets ran over a deer on landing. My 2 friends and I had to clean the mutilated deer out of the gear well. It was unfathomable. Story 100. I had a disquieting cyst on the back of my leg. It was a nerve sheath tumor. Doctors did not know what it was. The last time I checked, they were running tests on it. Story 101. Here's your answer. My Reddit feed had you both one after another. Story 102. I was a certified nursing assistant. I spent most of those years in assisted living or mental health. There was a lot of vomit, feces, urine, blood, and infected wounds. I had a coworker pass out after a resident broke her ankle and the bones were protruding. I certainly have not seen things as graphic as nurses, doctors, emergency medical technicians, and others. Story 103. I performed surgery for 25 years. I have seen a wide variety of cases, including gangrenous maggot-infested limbs, dead bowel, and rectovaginal fistulas. Story 104. Helping an obese goat give birth. I have assisted many births and they were easy, but we received a severely obese older goat on her first pregnancy from someone, and when she gave birth, the kid was turned around and stuck. I was elbow deep inside the goat trying to reposition the kid to get it out. I ended up dismembering the kid by hand inside her to save her life. It had been inside too long and suffocated. Otherwise, it would have decomposed inside her and caused sepsis. Her obesity and the fact that she was over 3 years old during her first pregnancy meant she would not be able to safely deliver the kid. Story 105. A dead rat torn in half with its intestines exposed was eaten by 2 of my outdoor cats. They were caught chasing it on closed-circuit television, caught the rat, held it, and then devoured it. The dead rat had no smell, but I gagged when I touched it, even with latex gloves. I placed it in a double plastic bag and threw it in the outdoor bin. So far, it is the grossest thing I have ever touched. Story 106. I have cleaned up dog feces, cat feces, and even monkey feces, but nothing could have prepared me for bearded dragon feces. Oh, and the almost fully exposed tendon in my arm. Story 107. It was not intentional. I went outside to look for my landlord's cat to come inside for the night. It was getting semi-dark, and I stepped on something warm. I looked down and realized I had stepped on the cat's hunt. A baby bunny that was still alive but had its guts, heart, and liver exposed. I had accidentally killed it and was touching it with my bare feet. I felt horrible, but the landlord's cat came the second I stepped on it, looking like I had insulted its hunt. It was a disturbing experience for a while. Story 108. Swordfish that fell out of the bag and behind a seat for a couple of days. Smelled terrible, so I thought it would be good catfish bait. Story 109. It's a toss-up between pulling my own hair covered in slimy shampoo out of the bathtub and cleaning up my dog's vomit. The hair gives me the heebie-jeebies even though it's my own, and the vomit just makes me gag. Story 110. I found a poor mother opossum on the road that had been hit by a car and was dead, but she had babies in her pouch. I had to go through her pouch and get all the babies out. It was unpleasant because I didn't have any gloves, but I am happy I was able to save her babies. Story 111. Not me, but my friend who was a nurse. She was bathing an old man with an uncircumcised penis that was not cleaned. She said the water started to look gross, cloudy, with something floating around like cottage cheese, and had a horrible odor. She said she was heaving. She told me it was smegma. Smegma is a harmless combination of oils, skin cells, sweat, and other fluids that build up around the genitals. It looks like crumbly cheese and usually has a foul odor. The best way to prevent and treat smegma is to regularly wash the genitals and surrounding areas with soap and water. She said the old man was unpleasant and splashed water at her, blaming her for what was going on. She told me the water hit her face. Story 112. Accidentally touching a slug recently caused me to have a severe panic attack. I rubbed my finger on the carpet for 10 to 15 minutes, hyperventilating. I have been afraid of slugs my whole life. Story 113. A decayed, bloated squirrel in the window well fell apart in my hands, with many parasites inside. We had been away helping a relative for a couple of months, and somehow it had become trapped there and died. Formative childhood experiences. Story 114. Circa 1995. I grew up working on a dairy farm. The cows were herded into a pen outside the milk barn, where they filed in to be milked. While waiting, the cows produced a lot of manure. The manure was scraped and pushed by tractor to a pit, which was just another part of the lot with concrete backing and sides. It filled until there was enough to load the spreader and disperse it back onto the fields as fertilizer. It was generally about 3 feet deep by the time spreader loading day came around. Our pit was right up against another barn or shed that we used as a garage for the four-wheelers, tools, and other equipment. That building had a couple of corrugated aluminum roof panels come loose from the wind, so naturally I climbed up to fix them. I was nailing them back in place when I got close to the edge. One of the boards that made up the truss of the roof had rotted away, and I stepped where there was no support. I fell about 8 feet right into the pit full of manure, and it was full. Cow manure will dry out if it sits in the sun. 2,000 gallons of it will form a crust on top and stay pretty liquid underneath for a long time. I broke right through the crust and was completely submerged in dank, week-old manure. I emerged looking like what I imagine a real-life swamp creature would, completely covered head to toe, even in my mouth. I remember stumbling down the hill to the creek, unable to see, stripping off my clothes, and just throwing myself in. I walked back home naked. So I would say rancid cow manure on my uvula and tonsils is the grossest thing I have ever touched. Story 115. I was sitting in an interview. We had a nice, mild-mannered man come in who looked like Kevin Spacey. This was a large corporate company, and we looked for certain qualities in candidates. We had specific questions to ask. He was asked, "What was a difficult situation you had to deal with, and how did you handle it?" He asked if he could refer back to a job he had in his 20s. We said, "Yes, please do." He worked in a psychiatric ward. He said one of the patients was a big, scary-looking man but harmless. A new female nurse was working, and this patient took a liking to her. He said it was almost like the patient changed in a positive way. This went on for weeks. Then the nurse was gone. She quit or moved away. The patient couldn't handle it but was bottling up his feelings. Then, suddenly, The patient covered both hands with his own waist and was thrashing around in the TV room. He and another employee called for help and tried to restrain him. He said it was like two cats trying to restrain a gorilla. At one point, the patient was on top of the other nurse, hands covered in waste, trying to rip off his face. Then my boss respectfully cut him off. I thought he was crazy for saying this. After he left, my boss said, "Nope, didn't need to hear that. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye."